What's up guys, this is Jan for Chess24. In this video we'll have a look at, I believe, the most exciting and most dramatic game of the Sinquefield Cup 2017 so far. An encounter between two of the co-leaders after 3 rounds. The world champion Magnus Carlsen and his former second, one of the helpers in his world championship match in the year 2016. The Frenchman Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. Here we see the two guys shaking hands. And before we get into the action, I have to give you some disclaimers. This is a long, highly complicated game. I've spent quite some time analyzing it, trying to figure out, but I can't really say that I spotted all the nuances, so bear with me. It starts off innocuous. Is that a word? Enough? MVL is a Grunfeld player who pretty much exclusively likes to go d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, d5 against one d4. And we've seen in the Sinquefield Cup that no one's really willing to go there with white. Instead, when battling with Grunfeld guys, people have played one knight f3. We've seen Levan Aronian do this. And Magnus Carlsen follows his footsteps for the first couple moves. MVL also follows the game Aronian versus Nepomniachtchi. Knight f6, c4, c5, knight to c3 and d5. After c takes d5, knight takes d5. Black is issuing an invitation to transpose back into Grunfeld territory. But white politely declines by playing the move e2 to e3. We've seen Aronian do this, who combined it with a very sharp idea against Nepomniachtchi. After knight takes c3, he went b takes c3, g6, h4. It turns out that Carlsen has a very, very different idea in mind. After knight takes c3, he plays a move that was news to me, even though it has been played recently, as I found out now. But he plays the move d takes c3, offering an exchange of queens at move number 6, which, after all the advertising I've done earlier on, does not look like the start to an epic battle. But in this case, it is. And make no mistake, Carlsen is not doing this to play for a draw. What he wants to get is a queenless middle game where tension can be created by using technique, maneuvering, things that the world champion typically excels at. At first sight it looks like white is slightly worse. He lost the right to castle, his pawns look weird, but if you imagine the white pawn going to e4 and the king going to c2, then very often in these positions white can be a little better because his pawn on c3 controls some key squares, while the black pawn on c5 cannot control these squares anymore. Therefore, it is not unheard of, and people have often played the line e4, knight takes c3, d takes c3, which is supposed to be a little better for white. Therefore, after e4, black typically goes knight to b4. So this e3, knight c3, dc3 idea, even though I don't think it's the refutation of the Grunfeld, it is by no means a peaceful line. And in the game where it was played recently, the game Radjabov against Peter Svidler, white went on to win this position. MVL follows Peter Svidler's footsteps and plays the move bishop to f5, directed against e4. Of course, knight to c6 was a very logical option as well. The world champion insists on getting his pawn to e4, goes knight to d2. And after knight c6, plays e4, kicking this bishop. This is where MVL decides to go his own way, plays a very logical move, bishop to g6. Svidler had placed the bishop on e6 instead. Bishop g6, and here if Carlsen were to choose the most normal move, completing his setup with king c2, then this bishop would stare down the king along this diagonal after something like long castles, intending maybe knight to e5. It looks like black would be doing fairly okay. Instead, Carlsen plays a more accurate move, goes for the move bishop, do damage to the black pawn structure. If, let's say, e6 takes, king to e2, the black position would be fairly unpleasant to play, in spite of his two bishops. Therefore, MVL has to react and play rook to c8, so he can recapture on c6 with the rook. Next on the agenda for Carlsen is, let's push all the flank pawns that I have. He starts with the move h4, threatening h5, but it's rare at this level to see somebody blunder their bishop like that. Therefore, the main idea of h4 is to gain some space on the king side. MVL goes h5, not allowing any further expansion. And Carlsen plays a move that surprised me. I still don't think it's great, but maybe it's in the same spirit of let's keep it complicated, let's keep the piece on the board. He goes for the move rook to e1. And what's strange about this move is that he loses sight of his h4 pawn, and after the very logical e6, followed by bishop to e7, you have to spend more time defending it. Therefore, instead of rook e1, f3 looks like a more normal way to play, but after a6, Carlsen probably thought in this position there's not enough tension left to play for a win. And instead, he goes for rook to e1. When MVL decides not to question this bishop, but instead plays e6, a4, and bishop to e7, attacking the pawn. White has to spend the tempo on covering it, and now he can get back to his business, which is pushing his other flank pawn, the a pawn, all the way to a6 if allowed. It's a fairly typical strategy for these positions, because first of all, if black ever goes a6, then this pawn not only fights against b5, but can also be used to fix the structure on the queen side at an appropriate moment by a5, creating a potential weakness here. While if the pawn, as in the game after castles, is allowed to a5 and black does not play a6, then the pawn wants to go to a6 himself and force black into a tough decision. That happens in the game, rook fd8, a6, b6 is best, because if you take, then rook takes a6 is just unpleasant to deal with all these weaknesses. Therefore b6 has to be played, but this is not pleasant either to let the pawn on a6 live, because we'll see it later in the game. You can always imagine scenarios where white sacrifices a piece on b6 and then the a-pawn runs, or this bishop, let's not overdo the arrows, this bishop one day in the distant future gets to the a7 pawn. This is a constant long-term nuisance for black, but of course white had to pay a price for it as well. He spent a lot of time pushing his a-pawn, and black finished his development, has all his pieces centralized and ready for action. So I'm not saying white is better, I'm saying it's an unbalanced position. But computer-wise speaking, especially after Carlsen's next move, king to c2, the computers actually think that black has the more pleasant position and prefer to keep the king in the center by going king e2. But king c2 once again is more ambitious in a way, because you could picture this king in the distant future invading on the queen side. MVL plays logical, goes knight to e5. This knight improves his situation, plans to go to g4 or even to d3 if allowed. But Carlsen immediately asks it to occupy his new outpost on the g4 square. Goes knight to g4. King to b3. The king, of course, does not want to stay forever on the same diagonal as the black bishop. And MVL says, you know what, I like having my bishop on the same diagonal as your king, let's do this. And he goes f6, intending bishop to f7 or bishop to e8, and also just in general, intending to reactivate this bishop. There was a bit of a spectator on the g6 square. Knight to c4, introducing a theme that I talked about a bit already. Black always has to at least keep an eye on knight takes b6, followed by a7, sometimes as bishop c6, supporting the a-pawn. Therefore, there are topics around this, but knight c4 also has one drawback, which is it loses sight of the e4 pawn. MVL immediately uses that, goes knight f2, attacks the e4 pawn, also eyeing the juicy little square on d3. But for now, Carlsen has to push his pawn to keep it, goes e5, and the knight jumps to e4, threatening a new pawn on g3, which is not so easy to defend without making clumsy moves. White can wait defending it for one half move by playing bishop to e3, because if you were to take now, then rook g1 would pick up material along the g file. But after bishop e3, bishop f5, now this pawn is very much under attack. Therefore, Carlsen has to play the passive move rook to g1 to keep it, which I'm sure he wasn't thrilled to do, but no choice. MVL goes for rook to d5, hinting at maybe wanting to double his rooks on the d file. Rook ae1, the other rook occupies the e file, and Carlsen is already planning an elaborate regroupment, which we'll see over the next couple moves after king to f7. Now that his rook is in the game, he puts the bishop back to c1, which at first sight intends to go knight to e3, knight fork against knight and bishop. But after this bishop leaves the f5 square, goes to h7, he shows that this was not really the plan, but instead he goes rook to e3. Now this rook is being used to cover the g3 pawn, and the other rook has the idea to return to the center, go to e1, and force this knight out of the powerful e4 square. So nice maneuvering by the world champion, but make no mistake, white is not better here. MVL so far has done everything perfectly well. His pieces are very well placed, very coordinated. After rook c d8, bishop to c6 is played, but MVL shows he's ready for this as well. And he's saying, I don't really believe that you want to take on d5. Plays an excellent move here, a positional exchange sacrifice, the move knight to f2. Saying, you know what? You want to take the exchange? Be my guest. I'll recapture. You have to put all your pieces on very silly squares like knight a3, activating the whole black armada. c4 is looming, bishop to c5 check. The knight can jump to e4 or g4. The a6 pawn is on crease. It's a lot of activity for the price of an exchange. And Carlsen, in my opinion, rightly so, decides not to take on d5. Instead goes rook to e2, questions the knight where he wants to go, and the knight sets up shop on a pretty nice square as well, the d3 square. Still not afraid of bishop takes d5. Carlsen instead takes on f6 because his knight on d3 also kept an eye on the e5 pawn, so one less headache to deal with if black wants to take on e5 in the near future. Takes here gf, and once again, I believe correctly, decides not to take on d5. Here, if you were to take rook takes d5, it's even a strong move, tending to go b5 and then c4. With, once again, a lot of activity for the exchange. So Carlsen says, okay, good job, Maxime. I was just checking. I will return to b5 and maintain this grip on the light squares on the queen side that I had going earlier. And the position remains, what do I know, but remains more or less balanced. The computer shows 0, 0, 0 here, and looks like both sides struggle a bit to improve their pieces, which leads to some weird maneuvering over the next 8 to 10 moves, where I'll do my best to explain what's happening, but I'm not really sure. Mainly both sides are just biding time, hoping for a mistake by their opponent, while not allowing any inroads into their own position. Rook g8 targets this pawn, bishop to d2, and rook back to d8. Bishop to e3, bishop to e4. Now that this square is available, comes in handy to put the bishop there maybe. Maybe not go f5 to cement it here. Bishop c6 is still not really a topic. Here it would run into some tactics after knight to b4. Don't even ask me how this works, but it does seem to work. But in general, bishop takes d5, e takes d5 is still not a big strategic threat from black's point of view. Therefore, Carlsen continues the slightly cryptic maneuvering, goes rook to d2, rook to g8 back, king to a4, hinting at bishop to c6, followed by king b5. But after rook d8, he says, you know what, I don't really want to do that, and goes back to b3 after bishop c6. Once again, there's weird tactics in the position. In this case, the move rook to d4 seems to be strong. Tending after c takes d, bishop takes c6. Once again, sacrifice the exchange for a lot of activity after king b3, b5. And hell keeps breaking loose. But both players are in time trouble here, and these variations are mainly theoretical. The main point is bishop c6 is never a big threat, because after bishop d5, ed, black is okay. Therefore, Carlsen says, okay, I was just checking, I'll go back to b3. MVL says, okay, I'm good with the draw, I'm gonna keep repeating moves. Do you want to repeat moves further? And Carlsen says, no, I like to on a2 instead of a4. Well, it's a bit of a concession because it's a more passive square. MVL says, okay, you don't want to draw? I'm willing to fix the structure, play f5 now, stabilize. Which wasn't forced, and I'm not sure it's a good idea. But for now, the balance is maintained, because it also gives black some active options, like bishop takes h4 all of a sudden is looming. Rook h2 controls that h-pawn just in case. Rook to c8. MVL says, you know what, I'm in time trouble, I don't want to have to think about bishop c6 for at least half a move. Rook to d2 back, once again repeating moves. Rook g8, MVL once again saying, if you want to repeat moves, I'm game. Carlsen says, nah, still want to play on. Goes for the move rook to e2, which looks harmless, looks like just another waiting move or a way to repeat the position further. But here on move 39, right before the time control, MVL starts losing this fight of shadow boxing. Goes for the move bishop to f3, probably anticipating that the rook will go back and they will repeat moves further with bishop e4. But now after bishop f3, rook to h2, all of a sudden black has outmaneuvered himself. We'll go to what damage has happened here in a second, but first I like to point out that instead of bishop f3 in mutual time trouble, MVL had a nice tactical shot here, which my guess is both sides missed it. Of course, I'm not sure about that, but there was the option to go bishop takes h4 in this position, which Carlsen originally played rook h2 to avoid. After g takes h4, the point is rook takes g1, bishop takes g1, and the knight fork, knight c1. Keep this knight fork in mind. It will play a key role in the events to unfold later, attacking the rook and the king simultaneously. Therefore, bishop takes h4 was possible. It does not lead to a black advantage because white could play the move rook h2 now. Maybe Carlsen saw this, I don't know. Intending bishop takes g3, rook takes h5. When white has lost a pawn, but he's activated both his rooks in a way. Therefore, keeping the balance, the computer gives something like rook g7, rook h8 with equality. But yeah, that was a shot that MVL probably should have gone for. Instead, bishop f3, rook to h2, and here it's not so easy for black anymore. If the bishop returns to e4, then bishop to c6, a move that has been around for a while, gains in strength now that black has played f5, and some lines bishop d5, ed5, is a little more nasty. And there's also the option of going knight back to d2 before taking on d5. All of a sudden, black's pieces are a little awkward here. For example, if you go back, then white takes and goes knight to d2, picking up this pawn, which is unpleasant. And yeah, if you decide to ignore it by going rook to d8, then knight to d2 is asking some unpleasant questions as well. Because one day white could take on e4, then take on d5 and say, I am an exchange up. Therefore, it's not ideal to return to e4, and MVL instead plays the move bishop to f6, trying to take control of the e5 square. But after knight to d2, this is the first move after the time control, move 41. Black has run into some trouble. Once again, bishop e4, not ideal, because now the knight can capture it. So the bishop has to go to g4, but that is a much worse square. Does not really control the long diagonal. It blocks his own rook from attacking the g3 pawn. And Carlsen immediately, first of all, realizes his rook no longer has to defend the pawn, so it can be used. Secondly, makes sure that this bishop cannot return to f3 and e4 any longer, intending to, too many arrows, to bring the knight back to c4, then go rook d2, and make the black defenses crumble. Because let's not forget, there is still this theme of knight c4, bishop c6, knight takes b6, and a7, which now with this bishop away from the long diagonal gains in strength as well. MVL goes rook g d8, Carlsen plays knight c4, returning his knight to prominence, and MVL rightly understands he cannot wait any longer, tries to change the nature of the position by going e6 to e5, activating his pieces, but also weakening some pawns, opening some diagonals that were not opened earlier. And after f takes e5, bishop takes e5. Objectively, white is better here, but to prove that he has to play very sharply, very directly, Carlsen does play a good first move, the move bishop to g5, targeting this rook. And it turns out the rook can't really move. If it were to go anywhere, let's say rook g8, then the knight jumps to e3, completely overloading the black defenses. Sorry. The rook is hanging, this pawn is hanging, this is a threat. Bishop to c4 is a threat. Rook d2 is probably a threat. There's just nothing to do. Therefore, this rook cannot move, and MVL, who had no doubt anticipated that, decides to fight fire with fire and start a counterattack against the white rook by going bishop takes g3. And this is probably the key moment of the entire game. Carlsen has two rook moves. One leads to victory, the other does not. The one he should have chosen is the move rook to d2. Maintaining most of the tactics that we were talking about earlier, it's still impossible for black to move this rook away. Let's say he goes to c8. Other squares is a similar story. This time the key tactic is knight takes b6 after a takes b6, bishop c4. This diagonal, which has been open, comes back to haunt black. King e6, for example, rook takes d3, and it's 3. After rook d2, MVL would have had to come up with something else, but it turns out his pieces are strangely immobile. The computer gives king to e6 as the best move. And then, first of all, white can't take on d8 when he's much better. The computer even gives some cryptic moves like king to a1, saying, you know what, I'll just step out of any checks and there's nothing you can do. My pieces will sooner or later crush your pieces with all these ideas. Knight b6, ab, bishop c6, bishop takes d8. There's just nothing you can do. Try for yourself. It's very strange, but very tough position for black. So rook takes d2 was the way. But Carlsen has spotted another line, which he considers to be winning. The move rook to g2, which looks very tempting as well. This bishop can't really go anywhere. If it moves, once again, knight to e3. Crushes black. Therefore, MVL has to keep counterattacking. Plays the move bishop to h3. Rook takes g3, bishop takes f1, which is a position both sides must have been aiming for. And here, Carlsen should have just played the humble bishop takes d8, rook to f3, regaining first of all the exchange and then the pawn. All good, all good. But white is not better here. After bishop e2, rook takes f5, king e6. The position is roughly equal. Equal material. Both sides' armies more or less neutralize each other. Instead, Carlsen had spotted a different option. He wanted, after bishop takes f1, to leave this bishop alive for now and start with rook to f3. His point being that after bishop to e2, the rook can go to e3, from where it not only attacks the bishop on e2, but also targets the e7 square. And if this bishop were to go anywhere, let's say back to f1, then rook e7 check, king g6, rook takes a7. Should win the game for white because his a-pawn is just so powerful. This is still hanging. Looks like white is doing extremely well. But he had missed a little detail. And maybe you guys remember what I said earlier. Don't forget about this knight c1 knight fork in this position after rook e3, which was not played, by the way. This would have been, or was a very cool show, no doubt, for Magnus Carlsen. There is the tactic f5 to f4. The point being that after rook takes e2, this f-pawn blocks the diagonal, so the bishop no longer controls the square. And after knight c1 check, black is winning the rook and the game. Not only that, after f4, if white goes back to the idea of activating his rook, going rook e7, king g6, rook takes a7, all of a sudden this f-pawn itself is a tremendous force to be reckoned with. After rook takes g5, h takes g, f3, it's not the a-pawn, but the black f-pawn that wins the day for black. Therefore, Carlsen is in real trouble here. And no doubt, he went on to realize that. Let's have a look at bit of video, all video footage, by the way, courtesy of the Grand Chess Tour, which were nice enough to allow me to use it if I manage to bring it up, which is, of course, never a given. Let's see. Here we see the world champion shaking his head after bishop e2. No doubt having realized that rook to e3 runs into f4. And all of a sudden, yeah, he finds himself in a very tough spot, just being a move removed from a winning position after, or a bit more, after bishop takes g3, rook d2. Now Carlsen all of a sudden has to fight for survival after this move bishop to e2. I've analyzed this a bit. It's not easy to find anything. One line the computer gives us rook takes d3, rook takes d3, e6, takes d3. This rook is still hanging, but after rook takes d3, bishop takes d3, bishop takes d3. Black is probably winning this opposite colored bishop endgame. The pawn on a6 is dropping, the f-pawn is running. It does not look great for white. Carlsen instead tries to find a different way out after bishop e2. He spotted some nice tactics, starting with bishop takes d8. Of course, MVL takes on f3 is now currently an exchange and a pawn up, but there is still the a-pawn, which is now white's last hope for salvation. Carlsen goes for the move bishop takes b6, sacrificing another piece to get the a-pawn running. There was an alternative here, bishop to c7, trying to pick up the a-pawn more slowly by going bishop b8 and bishop takes a7. But it turns out that the black army is too strong to allow such slow plans, I should say, to work. After king e6, bishop b8, knight c1 check, king a3, rook d1. All of a sudden, black manages to organize a mating attack against the white king. Bishop takes a7, knight to d3. And here, after bishop takes b6, rook a1 check, king b3, bishop d1 would be checkmate. So white has no time for such luxuries, such as bishop c7 and tending bishop b8. Therefore, Carlsen tries bishop takes b6, which almost works. After a takes b, his point is not the move a7, when the rook would just go back and, together with the bishop, stop this pawn for good. But instead, he starts with bishop to c6, threatening to run the pawn. And if black were to play, let's say, rook d8, then bishop takes f3, white would be winning. Black only has one move to maintain the advantage here, but that move is good enough. It's the move bishop to e4, which MVL plays, putting this bishop on a protected square, so that you can now retreat with the rook, and after bishop takes e4, recapture. This is not the end of the adventures. The a-pawn goes up, a7, rook d8, and Carlsen has one last trick in this position, the move knight d6 check, trying to either distract the rook from the 8th rank, so the a-pawn can be queened, or if the knight is being left alive, then the knight can be used to take this bishop. And white maintains very decent drawing chances. Probably this is actually a drawn position. There is a drawback, however, after knight d6. Black can just take the knight. Rook takes d6. And if white were to get a queen, the price he had to pay for it is too high. After rook takes c6, black has two minor pieces and a rook and the passed f-pawn for the queen, which is just way too much material. Everything's protected in the black camp, so this position is just hopeless. Instead, Carlsen, obviously aware of that, blitzed out the move bishop takes e4. When after f takes e4, a8 queen, the situation is of course different, but MVL plays a better move, rook d8, once again controlling the a8 square, and using the fact that after bishop takes d3, rook a8, for example, would pick up the a7 pawn. Therefore, black has nothing better, white has nothing better. I'm going a8, rook a8, bishop takes a8, and the smoke clears. We have a minor piece endgame where black has an extra pawn, the extra f-pawn, which gives him a decisive advantage. It's not trivial yet at all. First of all, white could potentially organize some counterplay against the black queen side. White could also bring his king to fight against the f-pawn, so black still has to be very careful. MVL starts with the move knight e5, trying to help his f-pawn to go all the way to f3, and also thinking about grabbing another pawn on h4 by going knight g6. King b3, activating the king, f4, makes sure this king has no time for adventures such as king a4, king b5. Instead, the king has to come and help against the passed f-pawn. King to c2, MVL plays a move that looks strange at first sight, but makes a whole lot of sense. He plays the move king to g7. His point is he would like to grab the h-pawn, but if he starts with knight g6, then there's a counterattack on the black h-pawn as well, which doesn't really help him this transaction. What he's doing by playing king g7 is preparing to go king h6 whenever his h-pawn gets attacked, defending it, picking up another pawn. That is what happens, but it's still not the end of our adventures. King d2, knight g6, king d3. The world champion is fighting with the very limited resources that he has left in this position, centralizes king and invites the black pawn to advance to f3, which MVL does. f3, this is a, well, I believe the position is still winning, so we can't really call it a mistake, but probably not the cleanest way to victory. It was cleaner to go knight g6, intending to just activate the king first, go king f6, king g5, and then run with these two passed pawns, with the knight being mobile. If white tries to do something about that, to go king f5, then f3 just transposes into a winning pawn endgame. So there was nothing white could do to stop this plan. King f6, king g5. Instead, f3, of course, looks perfectly logical, threatens f2. But here after king e3, things aren't that simple. this knight has to keep defending the f-pawn, and this pawn can be attacked in some situations by the white bishop. Therefore, black needs to try to bring his king as reinforcements, but it's not so simple yet. Let's look at the variations. King f6, Carlsen tries the move b4, offering the exchange of one pair of pawns on the queen side. And if black were to continue with this plan here, let's say king g5, all of a sudden this position is a draw. B takes c5, b takes c5, bishop to d5, king to g4, threatening king g3, but why isn't time to stop it by going king f2? And here, it's very hard to make any progress without losing a pawn. The knight continues to defend this. King f4 is a logical move. Bishop f7 targets the h5 pawn. This position is a draw with the simplified material. Therefore, MVL after b4 has to do something else, and he does find the only way to victory. He does find the move c5 to c4, sorry, in this position, c5 to c4, keeping more material on the board, even though c4 means black is willing to part ways with not only this pawn, but another pawn, just in order to activate his king. And it turns out that the tempi just work in his favor here. Black is winning. Bishop d5 attacks the pawn, king to f5, bishop takes c4, takes it, king to g4, king f2. But now black does have the required tempo to bring his knight back in business to support the f3 pawn, because the bishop is currently not attacking it. He goes knight g6, and the plan is knight e5, king to f4, then knight g4 or knight d3. There's little white can do about it. White manages to grab the h5 pawn even here. Bishop e6 check, king f4, bishop f7, and h5 is falling. It does not matter, because after knight e5, bishop h5, knight d3 check. Even though the material all of a sudden is equal, the black pieces are just too strong. This knight on d3 and the pawn on f3. MVL goes king g3, king e3 was just as good. And it turns out that there is nothing white can do. Black has the plan to maneuver his knight to e3 or to h2, and then use it to help queen the f-pawn. Therefore, white has to try to bring his bishop to fight against these plans. Bishop f7, knight f2. But here it turns out that there's still nothing to be done if the bishop is used to fight against this plan to promote the f-pawn. Let's say bishop c4, knight g4, king e1. Oh no, I'm sorry. I should play bad. Knight g4 was still winning, but after bishop c4, it's stronger to play knight to e4. Just pick up another pawn on the queen side before going back to promotion plans. And after king e1, f2, let's say king e2, it doesn't really matter, king d1. Black can just take one of these pawns and then later on get back to his drop off. Queening the f-pawn, it's hopeless. If white does not do that, does not want to allow this knight to e4, capturing the pawn on c3, then there's very little you can do against the plan I tried to show earlier with knight to g4, knight e3, or knight h2, followed by f2, the pawn queens. There is absolutely no defense for white, and therefore Magnus Carlsen did resign here. You can try other moves, they don't change the outcome. King e1, for example, knight e4, c4, f2, king e2, king g2, the pawn queens. The world champion loses with the white pieces to MVL. Let's have a look at the moments after he resigned, of course, Carlsen. Still a bit shocked at how events developed here. Checking the score sheet, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. But he did lose the game, and that does mean that in the standings after 4 rounds in the Sinquefield Cup, MVL now is in the sole lead with 3 points out of 4. Even bungled a winning position against Peter Svidler, which he could have won as well. But okay, today his victory wasn't the only outcome, so he won't complain with the standings. While Magnus Carlsen falls back to 3rd place, like Usain Bolt, but is really just part of the pack on 50%, even though with 5 rounds still to play. Of course, we can't write off anybody yet. What a game! My apologies if I struggled to explain some of its elements. The key moment really comes in the position after bishop takes g3. After Carlsen had worked his magic throughout the time trouble and had outmaneuvered MVL to some extent. Here he failed to execute to play rook to d2, after which white was winning. Instead, he went rook g2, which is not yet leading to a losing position, but his plan to play rook f3 here, turn the position into a losing one, was time to bail out here. And the key detail that the world champion missed from afar has to be that rook e3 runs up to f4, rook takes e2, knight c1, family fork. I hope you guys enjoyed this struggle. I watched the game live. I found it very dramatic. And I'll see you for the next highlight video or on chess24.com. Thanks for watching. See you guys soon.